The Oregon Indians, where it comes from is, in 2007, I guess. I was living in Texas, West Texas, but I was up on the reservation hunting in Montana, and I got a big cow elk. This is November. You got her processed, brought her home, had her in my chest freezer, and then come March or April, I was suddenly moving to Colorado, and it you can't take a chest full of meat with you to when you move across the country. So and when the problem for me was that when I get an animal in the field, I always like assure it or promise it that this is terrible, yeah, but you're going to feed my family, and it's not just for sport, it's all for good use and all. Which I know that's kind of an empty promise, because I think if a predator came down from space and harvested me and told me that, I probably wouldn't feel much better. So it's not like the elk cares a lot, but it probably just makes me feel better, actually. But anyways, I couldn't take her meat with me, so I had to go door to door in my neighborhood giving away roasts and steaks and ground elk and sausage and everything. And then I moved to Colorado, and I started thinking, man, why would those people I gave all that meat to have trusted me? And I started thinking of all the reasons they wouldn't trust me, because I always drove junky trucks and people don't like that. And I was always playing basketball in my driveway, keeping them awake with my dribbling. And my dog would always get loose and fight all the other dogs. There's a lot of reasons that they would not trust me, I think. And so I was thinking they probably just threw that elk meat away. And then that just like festered in me for probably 8-10 years, and me thinking I had broken that promise to that elk. And that's really probably what undergirds the Oregon Indians for me, anyways. As for My Heart Is a Chainsaw, coming out in August. Yeah, it's out in August 31st, I guess, right after Candyman. The reason I initially wrote this novel back in 2013, when it was completely a different book, was I had a few times I had read Jeffrey Eugenides' The Virgin Suicides, and I was always really captivated by the delivery method he uses for that novel, which is like a first person plural, or a royal first person. Is that what they call it? The we instead of I, and that just really captivated me. I mean, it's a good novel and all, but I thought, what if the content was interesting too? What if it was a slasher? And so I sat down and wrote a slasher in first person plural, and it didn't work. And I didn't know how to make it work, so I put it on the shelf and didn't come back to it until probably about 2017, somewhere around there. And I rewrote it all over again, and it still wasn't working. I gave it to and then I gave it to my agent, and she said, yeah, this is broken. And so I wrote a few more books, and then I went back to it because I really believed there was something there. And I rewrote it again, and I discovered finally who the protagonist was. I think that was my big problem, was like with that we delivery method, I couldn't figure out who the protagonist was. That's kind of built into the problem of that. And so I took away the first person plural, and it's now third person, and I have a protagonist, and it's a slasher. It's a slasher that happens 8,000 feet up the mountain in a town called Proof Rock in Idaho, small town. And there's a girl living there, Jade Daniels, who is kind of the town outcast. She's been praying for her whole life that a slasher would come to town and take care of all the people who have been bad to her. Then a slasher does come up, and it's kind of not exactly what she wished for. That's the way it works with slashers. She should have watched more Timmy Turner. Timmy Turner would have told her to word your wishes a lot more carefully. And that's where Good Indians and My Heart Is a Chainsaw comes from.
Great. Well, that gives a good opportunity to talk about just because you are very prolific. You're writing a lot. In a lot of different genres, not genres, in a lot of different forms, novels, novellas, short stories, comic books. What could you talk a little bit about your journey to becoming a writer? What drew you to writing?
Yeah. Now I'm doing television and features too. So I'm doing everything that I can think of that has words, I guess, except for songs. I can't do lyrics. I can't do lines in poetry. But how I became a writer. What happened was, I never planned to go to college. I never even graduated high school the right way. I just kind of snuck out and ended up getting a diploma in a stupid way. But the only reason I had my SATs was that while I was still in high school, there was a girl I wanted to ask out, but I didn't know how to ask her out, of course, because I can't think of that kind of stuff, And I knew that like she had plans for her life, and she was going to take the SATs and go off and do everything, and I had no plans. I mean, I had like 82 truancies that semester, and I didn't have any plans at all. Just I was just going to go to the pool hall and be better at pool. That was my big plan in life. But I knew that if I signed up for the SATs, I could offer her a ride to the SATs because she had this little blue Subaru that she had inherited from her mom, and it was broken down at the time, and so she didn't have a ride. So I signed up for the SATs, gave her a ride to the SATs. I took the test. I didn't care about the test, and I ended up doing good on the test. I've always been lucky with tests. I like to game tests, really, is what it is. But and we ended up dating for like 6 weeks or something. So it was all for the good. And but because I had those SATs, like because I had them done, my mom, when I finally got my diploma, she took me out to eat, and she said, she gave me two things. She gave me a suitcase. She said, "You got to get out of town, or you're gonna die being here," and because she could see the way I was headed, and she gave me a little brass apple, which I've still got it here if I can dig it out from under my monitor. I found it in a box a few years ago. And hold on. Yeah, a little bitty brass apple. And I thought, well, she found that on the clearance rack at Coach House Gifts. I don't know why she gave me a brass apple. I don't have any use for that. Anyways, she said I was saved up, and you're always reading books, and I'm going to pay for you to go to one semester of college. And I thought, well, heck, I can go. Up. It was 2 hours away, Lubbock, Texas Tech University. I said I can go to hang out for 4 months somewhere, no problem. And I think what she knew was that I would like find people up there or find something up there, because it was true. I went up there and I registered late, so I just had to take all the classes that nobody else wanted. And I ended up in a reasoning class, a beginning philosophy class. And I sat down in that classroom, and for the first time in my whole life, I was sitting among people who were talking about what they had read and caring about it. All coming up through school, people would talk about what was assigned, but they never did it with any care or any affection or any interest, really. But in this class with like 17 people, everybody was invested in the philosophy, and it just blew my mind. And I had to declare a major, so I wanted to be Indiana Jones, so I declared archaeology. And I went to my first archaeology class, and my professor, the very first day, a guy named Dr. Campbell, he said, I know y'all are all here for the adventure, but let me tell you, the only digging left to do is in laboratory drawers or museum drawers. And so that kind of disenchanted me. And then I liked school so much, though, that I got loans and jobs and put myself through the rest of it. My mom did a good thing, of course. She knew where I needed to be. And my second semester there, I'm sitting in the back of World Lit 2, big old like 300-person auditorium, dark, and the professor's just like Elvis way up there, and two police officers come in, and they lower their glasses, and they're looking around, and I'm like going lower and lower in my seat, because every time the cops are in the room, they're there for me, and sure enough, they see me and they pull me out. And so I get my spiral and my pen, and I slouch out with them into the lobby. And instead of like confessing whatever I thought they would be there to, get me for, I just waited for them to talk, because I've been in trouble enough to know that you don't confess. You wait to be accused. And oh wow, some weird noise. And what they told me was one of my uncles, who lived 2 hours away where I was from in Midland, Texas, had been burned over all of his whole body. They didn't expect him to live, and the town I was in, Lubbock, had the best burn unit in the whole West Texas region. So they had airlifted him there, and I was the only family member they could find for some reason. So they delivered me to the burn unit ICU, and I sat there for 3 days and 3 nights waiting for him to live or die. And all I had with me was my pen and my notebook. So I got bored and wrote a story. And when I came back to my Composition 2 class on Monday, after missing Wednesday and Friday, I think, I didn't have whatever personal essay I was supposed to have written. So I just tore those pages out of my spiral and gave them to my professor, my instructor. And I said, this proves I was writing anyways. It's not what you wanted, but here it is. And she took it, and she liked it enough. It was a story. She liked it enough that she typed it up and entered it into a departmental award, which it won. And that just blew my mind, that you can win money for telling lies. I've been telling lies my whole life. and all I got out of that was sometimes I got out of trouble and sometimes I got in worse trouble, you know. But it was amazing. And so I thought this is the road to happiness. And so I just kept writing stories. And by that time I was a philosophy major. And then my final semester of undergrad, my advisor said, if you take one more English class, you'll be a dual major. So I took another English class, and then I thought, well, it's time to go home and farm. That's what I always want to do, is farm. And but my professors convinced me, and it was just easier to do it than to keep them from talking to me. They convinced me to apply to grad school. I didn't even know what grad school was. I didn't understand that at all. And so I just compulsorily submitted applications to philosophy school and English program, my writing program. And the writing program got back first. And they said, hey, we'll pay you to be a TA and you can come here for 2 years. And I thought, 2 more years, what the heck? And I did that. And then I got a good fellowship for a PhD, and I figured, what the heck, I'll do that. And I did my PhD in 2 years, which was the record at Florida State University, I think. And also at their big graduation ceremony, I was the first tribal member to graduate in 33 years with a graduate degree. Evidently I was on the program. I had checked some box that I was going to be at graduation. So they had like Seminole dignitaries up there and all this, this junk on stage. They were going to like honor me, and they called my name and I wasn't there. I was in Arkansas doing something, but that's the way it goes. Anyways, then I went back to Texas to work in a warehouse, because that's all I'd ever done my whole life was manual labor. And I figured that's what I need to do. It was fun doing all this book stuff, but I need to get back to lifting and moving. But about 10 months, a year into that, I hurt my back really, really bad. And as soon as I could sit up in bed, my wife brought me a Thrifty Nickel, which is a classifieds back then. And she had circled all the jobs that I was now fit for. She said, we decided I had to have a desk job. I couldn't do like dolly jobs or forklift jobs anymore. And the thing we kept circling was bookkeeper. And I'd call those, and I finally got an interview on one of those bookkeeper things. And it turns out that bookkeeping is accounting. I thought it was going to somebody's house and like advertising their books. I had no idea whatsoever. But in the very last classified thing that we circled was just a little bitty short one. It said, full-time job with benefits, must pass spelling test. And I've always been a natural speller. That's something I've always had. I don't know why. And I thought, well, I can do this. And I had to get benefits because my wife was pregnant. We're about to have a kid. And so I went down and turned out to be at a university library where I'd got my undergraduate degree in philosophy and English. And it was a book cataloging job. And I sat in a little study curl with a woman who read me 100 words, and I wrote them all down, gave them to her. She came back about 20 minutes later and she said, you spelled every word right. You got the job. Because when you're writing stuff in books, like the cataloging information, you have to spell stuff right, And I got that job. I worked there for probably 2 years. And while I was working there, the English faculty figured out that someone with an English PhD was over in the library, and I had a novel coming out. My dissertation was coming out as a novel. I say as a novel, as if it was a novel. It was coming out anyways. And the weird thing about that dissertation was, I'm going backwards now. I'm sorry. I should have had this all like sequenced out better.
You're doing fine.
When I was doing my dissertation, you have to have like a quorum of professors. If like I had I think I had 4 professors, anthropology and 3 English people. And 2 weeks before my defense, one of my professors, Virgil Suarez, had to bail for a family emergency, and that left me with not enough people. And so they were going to have to reschedule my defense for 5 or 6 months later, if then. And I had to get out of town. I didn't want to be in Florida anymore. And so I went to a Gertrude Stein professor I'd worked with, Ralph Berry. I'd done good in his class. I was the only person to actually read the Gertrude Stein stuff. Everybody else just kind of pretended to read it, and he could tell. And I said, hey, why don't you come be on my committee? You don't have to read this stupid big book. All I need you to do is vote yes or no. You don't even have to vote yes. If you vote no, maybe the other 2 people will vote yes, and I'll still get passed. It doesn't matter. I just need a warm body on that defense. He said, sure, I'll do it. And he shows up to the defense, and his manuscript I printed out for him is all dog-eared and tabbed, written on. I thought, oh man, he did too much work. And then instead of asking me questions, he said, can I publish this? And I was like, whoa. Turns out he ran FC2, Fiction Collective 2, one of the longtime innovative presses in America, which I had no idea about. And I said, yeah, I don't think so. I'm going to be Thomas Pynchon, And I had a friend right then who his parents had bought him like this $11,000 short bed black Ford, which was a beautiful truck. But to invest in his future, he turned around and sold that truck, turned it into like $6,000 or $7,000, and took it to New York, where he took a 6-week workshop with Gordon Lish, who was a big hot thing back then. And to support himself, he was being a janitor all around Manhattan, which meant he had keys to offices. And so what he did was he would sneak into agents' offices and use their letterhead and fake cover letters from our manuscript that they would print out on their printers as well. And then he would break into other offices and leave that on the editor's desks as if it had made it up the creek, to them. And I got all rejected. And none of that worked out. It was really fun, but none of it worked out. So I went back to Ralph Berry, that guy from FC2 at Florida State University who had been on my defense. And I said, hey, you still game? And he said, I'm still game. I still like that novel. So it was coming out in 2000, and English faculty at Texas Tech knew about it. And I made it to be the final 3 finalists and got the job and became a professor, which I know I'm supposed to be talking about being a writer, but I think being a professor was really important to that for me, because being a professor gave me time to be a writer, because I had always worked, jobs where I get up at 4 and I work till noon, and then I'd have to come home and take care of my kids until my wife got off work, and I had to sleep somewhere in there and all. But being a professor was a different set of hours. And so I was able to just kick out book. And I just kept going. And I'm in retrospect, I'm really thankful for that back injury, I guess, because I would still be in a warehouse, pushing a dolly. That's what all I ever wanted to do. And and actually, now that I'm looking at it, this little brass apple that my mom got me when I was 18 and needed to get out of town, it has this little leaf on it here, and stamped on that leaf is teacher. So she somehow knew that this is where I'm bound to be. That's the way moms are. And that's my writing story.
That's a great story. It gives me this is the last question I'll ask, and then students have a bunch of questions. But I'm curious, you've told a story about philosophy and English and Pynchon, and yet your area is horror and these slashers and kind of violence. And you've said, I love this quote of yours, that the slasher story is a wonderful model and wish fulfillment. And I just want you to talk about, this class is a little bit about justice, about ideas of justice and how they come out in speculative fiction. And I just want you to talk a little bit about why you're attracted to the horror genre and the slasher, and Heart Like a Chainsaw coming out being a slasher. Yeah. What is the creative juice that gives you?
I think in horror, there are 2 types of justice cycles. There's an open cycle and a closed cycle. Let's think, Slumber Party Massacre is just some guy breaks out of his institution and gets a drill and goes and kills a slumber party. That's like a open cycle of justice, because those girls at that slumber party didn't do anything to lure that killer to them. They didn't commit any crime for which they need to be punished. They were just having a sleepover, and there's this dude killing them. That to me is pretty terrifying, actually. It's kind of like Reagan in The Exorcist. She's just 11-year-old girl bopping along, and suddenly she's got Pazuzu, a demon from across the Atlantic Ocean, in her head, in her body. But a closed cycle of justice is generally what most slashers are built upon, and that is, like in The Only Good Indians, it's Lewis and Ricky and Gabe and Cass. They commit a trespass, a crime, basically a prank. They break community standards. They kind of break ethical standards. They take food off of elders' plates. They go into part of the reservation they're not supposed to be on. They shoot too many elk. They don't have a tag. All kinds of bad stuff at once. And what that does is when there's that kind of injustice and it's not punished, their hunting privileges are stripped, but that is not really in keeping with the crime they inflicted. And I think that when the punishment that's meted out in the moment doesn't fit the crime, that in Slasherland, that can kickstart a spirit of vengeance that comes and gets justice. So that's basically Pamela Voorhees in Friday the 13th punishing camp counselors for letting her son drowned in the lake, and the problem is, as happens in Only Good Indians, slashers get carried away. Like Pamela Voorhees in Friday the 13th, she's not just punishing the actual camp counselors from 1957 who let her son die. she's punishing the whole class of camp counselors, which all these other camp counselors, they may be great camp counselors. You know, they don't really deserve the machete she's got waiting for them. Just like in the Only Good Indians, when Elkhead Woman is coming for those 4 hunters, that's her purview. You know, yeah, they are different people by now. They probably wouldn't make the same decisions now that they made 10 years ago. Nevertheless, they did the crime, you know, and so there is something coming for them. It's not instant karma, but it's karma that's kind of like magnified over the years, you know. But when Elkhead Woman comes for Denora, Denora has a little bit of armor by dint of not having been involved in the initial crime or prank, you know. So she is being outside the justice cycle, is therefore able to stand up against the slasher. And I think Final Girls are a wonderful model for us to follow, because they push back against bullies. You know, they run and run, and then they say no more. I'm gonna stop you from hurting anybody else. And yes, the slasher is a wish fulfillment in the sense that when we watch the news, you know, or just what if we're in the world, we see people doing terrible things and getting away. Not getting away like escaping, like the court says we don't want to ruin that person's life, you know. So yeah, it was terrible, but go on and do whatever you're gonna do, that kind of stuff. And in the slasher land, that's not the case. You do something terrible, then there's going to be somebody with a mask who stands up from your shadow and comes for you. Tell you the truth, I think we all comport ourselves better if we have slashers on our back trail, keeping us behaved, you know.
Certainly run a lot faster, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Emil, do you want to go ahead with your question?
Sure.
And just tell Stephen your name.
Sure. Hi, my name is Emil. I had a question about the role of tradition in your stories. I read an interview where you said that you wanted to make traditionals nervous in a sense, but tradition and kind of punishment for breaking tradition and adapting tradition still play a big role in your story. So how do you conceptualize tradition within your writing?
Yeah, no, I've never been asked that before. I like that too. Yeah, how to reconcile my pushback against the traditionals with these guys being punished for breaking traditional law. I like that. What I'm, you know, when I say that if you're making the traditionals nervous, you're doing the right thing. Like so many native writers get raked over the coals because, like Rebecca Roanhorse, you know, y'all may know her stuff. She did Trail of Lightning. Her most recent book is Black Sun. She's a really, really good writer. The Dene people, the Navajo, they got really mad at her for what they thought was corrupting some of their ceremonial stuff, I guess, using pollen in a way that that shouldn't be used, you know, associated with bullets. And my take on that is that when you freeze ceremony or life paths or life ways, when you freeze them, then they die, you know, they wither. Like we're not supposed to act like, we're not supposed to have all the same trappings and act like we did 200 years ago. We have to change with the times. And that's hopeful. That's what I'm trying to get across with. If we're making the traditionals nervous, you're doing the good thing. What I'm hoping to you know, promulgate anyways, is that we need to change. We need to adapt. We can't be the Indians in a John Wayne movie forever. You know, we've got to like in Lizzie Marmon Silko's ceremony novel, Teo, the protagonist, goes to see this medicine man, and you know, we're trained from movies and books to expect him to do the usual stuff, but instead, all around his place he lived, he's got phone books, that he's incorporated phone books into his ceremonial healing stuff, and that I think is the one of the most important things to have happened in American Indian fiction. That's really important to seed into the world. I think the fact that you don't have to use the same feathers and bundles you've been using for 2 centuries. You know, you need to change, and the only way to do that is to, yes, make those traditional people nervous. And you're right that in Only Good Indians, they are being punished for breaking with tradition, I guess. I don't have any answer for that, really. I guess I can try to say that I'm Legion, but that seems kind of grand, you know, I contain multitudes or anything like that. Yeah, I don't think I have any comeback for that.
Speaking of Rebecca Roanhorse, there he is. Can you ask that question about Rebecca, that references Rebecca Roanhorse? Tell Stephen your name first.
I'm Zichan.
Take off your mask so you can hear you a little bit.
My name is Zichan. And this week we also read like an interview with Dr. Ramhorst where she said indigenous people have already gone through an apocalypse. They're like living their dystopian novel like in this moment. And I want to know what you think about that quote.
Yeah, I'm not sure I heard that perfectly, but the fact that American Indians have already gone through an apocalypse.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, for sure. And people always want to say, America is a post-colonial place, but to tell you the truth, to us, it feels quite still colonial, you know? The settler mentality and manifest destiny, all that stuff, the big like myth-making steamroller is still rolling across the North American continent as far as we're concerned, you know? And you know, you can see that so easily when you go to conventions or conferences, because they always put like they'll usually have, you know, 2, 3, 4 native writers, and they'll try to put us all like in one little corner of a panel, you know, or they'll put us on one little panel in the corner of the programming, like a little reservation, like y'all stay over here and the real world's going to be over here, but y'all stay on this little postage stamp over here, you know. And people prefer American Indians to be invisible, or either invisible or made up, you know, like they want us to be stewards of the forest. They want us to be elves because elves don't exist, you know. But yes, I agree with Rebecca completely that an attempted genocide happened, and just because some of it was passive, which is to say some of it was microbes and bacteria that people didn't know they were carrying, doesn't mean a lot of it was not passive, you know.
Thank you. Also on the, we read you probably, I don't know if you saw this Strange Horizons did a roundtable with a bunch of people, Rebecca among them. And Martin, do you have that question? And take your mask off so we can hear you better. Martin's over here.
Yeah, the roundtable was focused on decolonizing, science fiction, and talking about indigenous futurism. And so we've done a lot of reading in this class about Afrofuturism as well. And can you talk more about, we read Yeti Okorafor specifically. So can you talk more about like just the influence these two have on each other, how they play off of each other, and like, see how like they interplay with your horror stories.
Yeah, that indigenous futurism, that's a term that Grace Dillon came up with, I think in her book, Walk in the Clouds, maybe. But it's kind of gone everywhere, of course, which is wonderful. And I love the idea of it. And the reason I like indigenous futurism, as a term or as a concept, is that just reading it feels like a revolutionary act, because what it's doing is it's positing Native people in the future, and that to me is wonderful. I think not just wonderful, but necessary. And what I like too is in a lot of the stories that are, in that vein, I guess, the rituals and ceremonies that are being enacted on, a different planet or a space station or whatever are changing, like I was talking about happens in ceremony. They're adapting. They're not the same as they were. There's still ties back, of course, to culture, as everybody has, whether you're, Irish or whatever, but things are changing. And I really like that a lot. And also, I think that the American like literary establishment, if you can think of it like a tree, with branches coming off, the main tree is what people want to call literature, kind of the literary stuff, which is great. I like a lot of it. And then the branches are the genre, the science fiction, the horror, the fantasy, and Westerns, crime, noir, all that stuff. Like the idea is that they branch off of the main trunk, and then you get further and further afield into like subgenres like slashers, which are way out on the ends. What I like about indigenous futurisms is that it kind of describes that we Indians are writing in the genres. We like the literary establishment wants us to keep us on the trunk. They want us to only do the prescribed things and talk about trauma drama, poverty porn, all that kind of stuff, which kind of feeds into a guilt complex that makes people buy books. A lot of people have capitalized on that and sold a lot of books from that, but I think it's more important to play out on the thinner and thinner branches, to not ask for permission to run out there, like, the fastest squirrel just to get out there yourself and do it. And you don't have to always be calling back to oral tradition. You don't have to be peppering stuff with words from your language. You don't have to like play the game, the authenticity game, really. That is, let me do these 3 or 4 things that'll establish that I'm Indian enough to have written this. I can go write Terminator 2 fan fiction if I want to, and I can do it as good as anybody, hopefully. And I don't need permission. I don't have to be non-native to do that, and I don't have to be a robot either.
Sarah, tell Stephen your name and what your question is.
I'm Sarah. So we've been reading lots of different types of speculative fiction work, like short stories and novels, and then now comic books. And so would you mind talking a little bit about how like you write comic books and how it compares to how you write novels, and like if you read comic books and if that's something hobby of yours?
Yeah, no, I've been reading comics since I was 12 years old. And I've always got comic books around, and yeah, I'm writing them now. I've got a graphic novel coming out in October, Memorial Ride from University of New Mexico Press. And but anyways, I'll probably hook up and do something for somebody. I don't know. And I've done some comic stuff before, of course. I do write comic books vastly differently than I write novels. And film and TV is a separate thing altogether. And film and television, you have to bring all the interior to the exterior, which is really a trick. In comic books, you don't have to do that so much, because in comic books, you have art, you have the speech balloons of dialogue, and you have captions. So those captions can often get you inside in a way that you can't on film unless you have a voiceover. And voiceovers are kind of the last fallback, on screen. But comic books, I write comic books slower than I write fiction, because I don't know if it's that I'm trained on fiction, but with comic books, I'm highly, highly sensitive to the units that the story comes in. And those units are panels and pages, and within the page, there's tiers. There's usually 3 tiers, but it's staggered and all kinds of different layouts. But the trick is, at the end of every tier, you have to have a delivery to the next tier. And then at the end of every page, you have to have a page turn, a reason for the reader to turn that page. And so I have to make the story fit into units of the page, and then break it down into more granular units of panels and tiers. And that to me is wildly difficult. I have to do it so many times to get it right. And I also have to remember, like Neil Gaiman says, that the silent panels in comic books are often the most effective. I have to remember that a good artist is probably going to be able to deliver this story beat in a nonverbal way. And so I don't need to clutter it up with my words, And I also have to remember to always give the artist as much room as possible. I really like the scripts I've read that, what's his name? Hawkeye, Dave Asia is the artist. Oh, I suddenly can't remember his name. I've got it on the shelf back here. Anyways, the writer for Hawkeye, Matt Fraction, that he wrote for Dave Asia, like, the product is hugely sophisticated, just elegantly done, but his scripts are so skeletal. It's just like, here's the story beats, here's some dialogue, do what you will with it. And then because there was such a good collaborative pair, they produced this amazing run on Hawkeye. Ideally, I can get to that state, or I can get to that. I think it's really about trust, and not being paranoid. And so if I can just lose my paranoia that if I don't say something, it won't get done, and I can just trust that the artist is going to do it, I think I'll finally become an okay comic writer. I think right now I can get by, especially if I have a good editor. Like the editor I was working with Marvel for Marvel Voices, she was really good. She made my story better than it was, at all stages. But yeah, comic books are slower for me than novels.
Yeah, thanks. Piper?
Yeah.
Take it.
Hi, my name is Piper, and we did actually read the Silver Fox story in the Indigenous Voices comic.
Mhm.
And we, as a class, really dialed in on the panel where Trigo was seeing the hanging and the massacre happening in the future. And we were just really impressed by how the colors and the emotion and the action and the dialogue all really came together there. So I was hoping you could talk more about how you and the artist work together, maybe on that particular panel.
My memory is for that page, or where he's at the middle of all the stuff, that what I did was I searched up those old Spider-Man covers when you'd have Peter Parker on the middle of the cover and all these like wavy lines going away from him. And in each little pie wedge, the wavy lines made, there'd be Aunt May, and then there's a Vulture, and then there's Jonah Jameson, and all the things that are pressing in on Peter Parker. And, he needs like all the anxiety medicine in the world because he's got huge pressure, I told him that's the kind of build I want. And he did it, he did it perfectly.
Let's see, how about Michael? Do you have your question?
Yeah. Online, you were compared to like a Jordan Peele of horror literature, and I was just kind of curious. What do you think about that comparison? What do you think about Peele?
I think he's probably funnier than I am, so it's not a really apt comparison. But no, it's an honor, of course. I think what people are keying on there with that comparison is they want to make The Only Good Indians out to be like what they might call social commentary horror, such as Get Out. I think Get Out kind of kicked the door open. Get Out and Victor LaValle's Ballad of Black Tom, in like a few months period, they kicked the door open for so many other horrors of that type to come through. And I think The Only Good Indians gets kind of classed as that type of horror, which is no problem with me. I don't think of it as social commentary. I think of it as a novel that has real people in it, and those real people are living under all these different sets of pressures, like Peter Parker. Except for these pressures are often predicated on them being Indian, and because the pressures in their lives are often predicated on that, and they feel the need to undercut that or push back against it or be in dialogue with it, that people call The Only Good Indians social commentary. But I didn't go into it with like a checklist of, all right, it's time to talk about identity politics, let's talk about repatriation, let's talk about activism, all that stuff. My only goal ever is to put real people on the page, because that's what I learned from Stephen King. Basically, I'm not like he called me up and told me. That's what I learned from reading Stephen King, is that people don't care about, if people don't care about the characters who are being put into the horror, then the story fails. They've got to care about the people. And so that's what I want to do on my pages, is have real people who then probably die because it's a horror novel,
Speaking of that, Chase, where's Chase? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Chase. Just because of what you write, I think we have to ask, what's the scariest book or movie that you've ever experienced?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the scariest novel I've ever read is Jack Ketchum's The Girl Next Door. It's not supernatural. It's probably technically a crime thriller more than it is horror, but man, you read that book and you come away. A lot of people will tell you that horror is like a roller coaster. It's like you're going on these tall dives, but you've got a safety bar. So it's like a vicarious threat of death. Not vicarious. It's like a fake threat of death, I understand that, of course, and it makes sense. However, I think there's a real threat with horror. And The Girl Next Door is a really good illustration of that, because it's about some neighborhood kids who kind of abduct this girl who lives on the block into their basement and torture her over like 2 or 3 weeks, terrible ways. And reading a book like that, you wonder if it's reprogramming your mind, like there's some horror I won't watch, like Serbian Film or The House That Jack Built or even Martyrs, because I'm afraid that what if I see something there that makes me a different person? And it's weird to have that fear, because that's what we want from art. We want art to challenge us and change us, but what if it leaves me, slowly stepping on puppies in alleys? That's probably not for the best. I don't think. I read The Girl Next Door 13 times over the past few years, trying to figure out the source of its horror. And I think I'm finally done with it. I think I was reaching the point where it was going to infect me or something, so I quit reading it. But that's the scariest novel I've ever read. The scariest movie to me, I'm probably going to go with, it's between The Ring and Paranormal Activity. Probably Paranormal Activity, I think. I saw an early screening of it back in, when was that? 2010, maybe, I guess. And it left me unable to sleep that night, of course. But when came out in the theater, I took my wife to see it. But before we went in the theater, I had like a sit down, serious talk with her that I know you like to play jokes on me because I'm a fraidy cat, but this is one you cannot stand by the bed and watch me sleep because I'm gonna freak out. You're going to have to lock me up somewhere, you know. And she, to her credit, she never has. But no, that novel real that I mean that movie really gets to me. Yeah.
Interesting. It seems like such a normal thing, you know, to be watching someone sleep, but in a certain circumstance, it's incredibly terrifying.
Yeah.
How about Thomas? There's Thomas. He's way. I don't know if you can see him. He's way at the end.
Yeah, hi, I'm Thomas. And so you may know that here at Duke, basketball is a really big deal. And I've also seen that basketball is an important sport on many Indian reservations and also an important role in your writing. So can you tell us more about basketball?
You know, I
And
think
we can see the basketball, Stephen, off your left shoulder. So.
Oh yeah, that's right. You know, I mean, the reason basketball is big on reservations, it's probably two reasons really. One is that a lot of reservations spend half the year covered in snow, and so you want to go inside in the gym and play. You know, I mean, if you're going to play something, let's play inside instead of outside. But two, basketball is cheap. All you need is a ball and some sort of hoop nailed to a pole somewhere. You know, you don't even have to have concrete. And so basketball is very cheap. Football can get expensive because you got all the pads but basketball is a cheap sport to play, and it doesn't require being in the snow in the winter. And yeah, basketball is I've used basketball in a lot of my books, and I wonder if The Only Good Indians might be the last one I do that in. I think I finally got it down the way I wanted to get it down. And I think the reason I was able to do that was because all the novels previously that I had used basketball in, I was still playing ball. But back in, what was it, 07, I blew up my ACL, my meniscus, had to have microfracture surgery on one knee. And then a couple of years later, I blew up my Achilles. And right when I was getting off, you know, wheelchair, walker, cane, I blew it out again, that same Achilles. And so I spent like a year getting my ankle rebuilt like Grant Hill, you know, except Grant Hill had a lot worse than I did, of course. But because he had actual talent, you know, he had stuff that was on the line. I didn't have nothing on the line, but except for my heart, I wanted to play. You know, I grew up playing ball. My coach used to tell me, he would pull me aside after practice and he would say, Stephen, you can't eat basketballs when you grow up. You've got to do your schoolwork. And I'd be like, no, I'm gonna eat basketballs. That's all I want to do, you know. And it was hugely important to me. And so it broke my heart when I realized that all these recovery periods from surgeries were impinging on my writing output, my fiction output. And so I had to make a decision between fiction and basketball. And fiction is something I can actually do, whereas basketball is something I just think I can do, you know? So I traded in basketball. I don't play anymore. Sometimes I will dribble that ball around in my study while I'm thinking of something for a story or a line. But I try not to too much because sure enough, I stop and start doing jump shots against the wall and then everything falls down and breaks, including me probably. But because I haven't been playing ball now for 10 years, maybe 11, I can fantasize about it a lot more. You know, like I have a distance from basketball now that allows me to properly mythologize it, I feel like, which is why I was able to do Denora. You know, I was able to live through Denora. Denora plays with a kind of heart and ability that I only wish I ever had, you know, like I would get, I mean, I think when I was in high school, I averaged 27 points a game, you know, which is all right. But the girl I was dating mostly for then, she would average like 36. And so she would always beat me, just like Peta beats Lewis in here, you know? Yeah, basketball, it's just, I don't know, I can probably talk on and on about basketball. My favorite line, I have two favorite lines from this book, actually. One of them is, if you come at a reservation girl, bring Band-Aids. And the other one is, if you're lucky, you're Reggie Miller. And if you're really lucky, you get to be Cheryl Miller, something like that, you know. I still get goosebumps when I think about Reggie Miller and Cheryl Miller. Mm-hmm.
We'll be sure to tell Coach K that basketball is cheap. I just wanted to, Ray is our student online. Ray, do you have any questions for Stephen?
Yeah, you sort of talked about how you approach writing comics and television and novels a bit differently. I was sort of curious how you determine what story to write in which format? Like, how do you discern that I want to write this story as a novel versus a comic book versus like I want to, like, you know, save this for
Yeah.
television or something like that? Like, how do you determine the format of the story that, yeah.
That's a really good question, because I hadn't thought about that question since I've been branching out in all these different formats and mediums. With the Only Good Indians, I thought I was writing a novella until it turned into a novel. With this book over here, with Mongrels, I thought I was writing Marvel stories and it turned into a novel. I can't always tell stories from novels very well. Comics, how do I decide? How do I decide? You know, I think I must just be lazy and let editors decide for me. Editors call me up and say, like the editor for Marvel Voices, she called me up and she said, or she wrote me or whatever, she got a hold of me. And she said, hey, would you want to write for Marvel? And I said, yeah, maybe. Because you can't act too eager. You know, I was like, yeah, I'm busy. You know, but then we worked out a deal, you know, page amount and page rate and all that stuff. And she said, all right, who do you want to write about? And I said Silver Fox. And the reason I chose Silver Fox was that she's Blackfoot, I'm Blackfeet. But back when, before like the 49th parallel cut the North American continent into, you know, America and Canada, it was all one confederacy, the Blackfoot Confederacy, you know. So we had the same language stock, the same rituals and customs and everything. And so I figured she's the closest I can do to writing a Blackfeet, you know. And it was, she came quite naturally to me. She was actually pretty easy to, she was an easy like story space to write from, I guess. That's weird to call her a story space. She was an easy character to inhabit, I think, for me. But let's see. So that's not really answering the question. And to tell you the truth, I don't think I have an answer other than editors present me with possibilities, and from the range of options they give me, I select one, you know.
That's interesting. You know, when you talk about that time travel, and I recently finished, this is an old book, not old book, but it's not new. It's Orson Scott Card wrote a book called Past Watch. You ever heard about that?
I read that. No,
Yeah,
I've read a lot of cards.
It's actually, it's really well done where you know, he doesn't explain the science, but they're able to watch the past as it unfolded. So they, you know, study minutely, you know, various parts of the past, and then they figure out a way to go back. And what they end up doing is changing Columbus's itinerary, so that there ends up being, there doesn't end up being a conquest of the Americas. He did a ton of research for it, clearly, but no one gets horribly killed, though there is something that happens with somebody's private parts that's pretty disgusting. But anyway, it's an interesting idea of, and it's this multicultural group that travels back in time.
Oh, that is so fascinating. I've got to read that. Thank you.
I think I just have one last question. One of the, at least in my view, and obviously this is because I also like reading and watching, is that we're in kind of a really golden age of speculative fiction. There's so much great stuff coming out, and a lot of it is because there are writers from all different backgrounds and all different perspectives, and they're sort of blowing up some of these, you know, for this class, we also watched a little bit of Avatar, you know, that old narrative once again, you know, the Dances with Wolves thing. So it's like, and having all these different voices really complicates and enriches the kind of stories that are told. But I'm going to ask Jenny to ask the last question, which relates to some of what Nnedi Okorafor has said about African futurism. Where's Jenny? There she is. So you can take the last question.
Yeah, hi. So I know you mentioned earlier about like the social commentary horror can play, and we talked about how Okorafor sort of argues that, you know, sci-fi is really one of the most effective tools for political writing. I'm curious, like, do you agree with that? Do you disagree? What your thoughts on sort of the political aspect of writing?
Yeah, you know, it's funny. Nnedi, whenever her and I are at the same conference, we always run into each other in the gyms or the hotels. We're the only two writers who go to the gym, evidently. So it's weird that we always end up there. And you know, talking about this like blooming or renaissance of all this speculative stuff happening. and or what I guess what people are calling the social commentary kind of spec lit is I wonder if a lot of that doesn't stem from Oscar Wilde's The Brief Life of not from Junot Diaz is The Brief Life of Oscar Wilde. Is it The Brief Life? The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde?
Yeah, The Brief Wondrous Life, yeah.
Yeah, that was 2006. And that was the first book I read where you had a person of color like geeking out on Star Trek and Conan the Barbarian and all that stuff. And I think that kicked the door open for a lot of people. It's too bad that Diaz himself, has turned out to be not that great a person and all. But I wonder if that book didn't kick the door open in much the way that Get Out did. But I'm not answering your question yet. I'm sorry. And I think I got off track enough that I forgot the point of your question. You were asking about oh yes. Is spec lit or science fiction in particular a good or the best vehicle for political discourse in fiction? Is that kind of it, right? Yeah. No, I think it's a wonderful vehicle, and I think it's because in the spec lit arena, you can exaggerate things in ways you can't if you're like in Richard Russo realism territory. My example of it, my go-to is I can write a story about me and my dad watching basketball on Sunday afternoon in our living room, and his brother gets drunk and comes over, my uncle, and kicks down the door, and my dad has to fight him, and they break all the furniture in the living room, and I'm hiding in the corner and things are terrible. And that gets a certain like emotion or feel or something across to the reader. And but I can also tell a story about my dad and I watching basketball on a Sunday afternoon, and a zombie shambles through the door. My dad has to fight that zombie, and they break all the furniture, and I hide. And I think that gets the same feeling across, but it can do it in like 2,500 words. Where I think that other story, the first one that sticks to realism, is probably going to take about 5,000, 6,000 words. Which is to say, I think spec lit or the conventions of spec lit can be an economizer. They can allow you to do things in a denser way in a shorter space. And for that reason, it can be more effective because it's not as big of a time investment for the reader, and you can smuggle things in. They think I'm just reading a cute story about zombies, but really you're telling them about something terrible that happened in your own childhood, and maybe allowing them to identify with something terrible that happened in their childhood, which doesn't necessarily address the political portion of your question. But Thomas King has a story called is it The Birds of North America? I think it might be The Birds of North America. It's a little short thing. It goes like 1,200 words maybe. And it's about being in a big city, and Indians are birds, and we keep flying into buildings. And it's one of the most beautiful stories I've ever read. And it gets across its political message of how America views Indians as these like, Quetzalcoatl feathered up beings, and also how disposable we are to America. And it does it in this wondrous, dense, elegant way that had he sat down and wrote a diatribe against or about the treatment of Indians in America, it would feel kind of didactic or like a rant, and we would all back off a bit. But because he tells us about pretty birds flying into buildings, we accept it better. It gets like across through our defenses better, which is one of the special abilities that spec lit has, I think.
Thank you. Any last questions or any other comments? Thank you so much, Stephen. This has been fantastic. And this is our last day of classes, so you've kept a Duke student audience wrapped on the very last day of class. That is quite an achievement. Thank you so much.
Thank y'all. Thank y'all very much for having me.
Yep, and we'll be in touch soon.
All right, bye.